For a lot of us, you're thinking this cannot be. This doesn't make any sense to me. Nothing about this makes sense to me. This couldn't be more out of the blue. Zero kind of cancer runs in my family. He said, second kind is lethal. It is very rare, it's fatal, and it always comes back. We have to do everything. And if we do everything, we throw the kitchen sink at it, we can save your life. I am a seize the day, make the most of life, passion for life kind of a gal. And I pretty much always have been. So example, we go on family dive trips. I got my children certified to dive when they were 13, the earliest age that you could do it. We like to travel. We love our dogs. We love spending time together. I'm married to a great guy, and I consider myself very fortunate.
And so, thank you for sharing that about yourself. Let's dive right into your story, which is fairly recent. I know that back in November of 2019 is when you first started to notice something wasn't right. Can you share what that was and how you took care of it?
Sure. I think one of the things that is very common for cancer patients is that we don't feel anything. Nothing's up. We don't have any pain symptoms or discomfort or anything like that. Same for me, except for that when one day late in November, I noticed that my urine was the color of rosé, like a deep rosé. And I thought, well, that's not right. And I'm old enough that menstruation could not have anything to do with it. But women are often kind of swept under the rug when it comes to things like that. It stopped. The afternoon was clear. Then the next morning, it happened again, a little bit of blood in the urine. And then I never had it again. That's the only symptom I had.
When you saw the blood in the urine, what was it was more like, oh, okay, so it's like a rosé colored, but what were you feeling? What were you thinking?
Well, I consulted Dr. Google, which is both a good and a bad thing. And I thought, so I immediately went to a lab and did a UTI test. Now you can get them over the counter, which is awesome. And so I was like on extra alert and a little concerned, but I have developed over the years a way of saying, okay, to myself, I don't have that information. If it is worst case scenario, I will have plenty of time to stress and worry and fret over it. And if it's not worst case scenario, why put myself through that in the meantime?
That's so wonderful.
Tried very hard to hang on to that. And then when the lab called and said, great news, it's not a UTI. I'm like, no, that is not great news. A UTI would be so much better.
It is so interesting, right, in the grander scheme of things, because at the core, we want to figure out, we know something's wrong. And if it comes back, someone would say, oh, good. Yeah, you don't have a UTI, but you're like, no, that means that it's something else. So you did end up making an appointment, and you called your OBGYN. So can you talk about that process?
Right. So I called the OBGYN. I treat her very much like my GP. A lot of us do, I think, especially if your GP retires and you're like, she knows me. We had babies together. So I called the nurses there, got a hold of one of them, and I told her what had happened. And she goes, well, let's just keep an eye on it. And I thought to myself, nope, I'm not doing that, because nothing good happens from waiting. What's the worst thing that happens if I go right away to a urologist and find out that it is nothing? I don't know what it could have been that was nothing, but it might have been. What am I? I'm not a doctor, so I don't know. That information can only help me, and waiting cannot at all help me. That would absolutely make things worse, especially given that it was actually something nefarious.
So you had it in you to say, I know something's wrong. I'm not willing to wait around to figure out if something worse happens from it. What were those next steps that you took?
I immediately started looking for a urologist, and for one that I could get in to see pretty quickly. And it was 2 weeks out. So I made the appointment with the urologist who had a good reputation.
How did you make that, sort of the decisions on and the research? You just went on Google and you just kind of looked for the reviews?
Well, first I call my friends. And I say, do we have a urologist in the stable of providers? Does anybody got one? But nobody had a urologist. So I did do some research and looked for grades, health grades, and a couple other things like that, and did what I could for due diligence. He had a good reputation, and everybody seemed to love him.
So you find a urologist through your research. Talk us through, at this point, it's a couple weeks later, it's mid-December, the holidays are approaching also. Talk about what that first appointment was like.
I go back to what I said a couple of minutes ago about when I've got something in front of me that I don't know the outcome, and I'm doing the discovery, I'm getting the answers. It's very scary. And we could very easily go to DEFCON 5. And what good is that going to do? I can't operate at my best abilities to make decisions and continue self-care and advocating for myself if I'm just freaked out. So I kept doing that, but it's beginning to take more effort at this point. But I did that, and we went in, and that was, early December. Yeah. So a little nervous, not too bad. Went in, did the cystoscopy, and I actually could see it. You could look over on the monitor and see, ooh, this little like soft cauliflower wafting is what it looked kind of pretty.
Did you know you would have a cystoscopy going into the appointment? Did somebody tell you, or was it like you went in and they were like, hey, this is what we're doing?
Oh, actually, yeah, I just collapsed two appointments together. So I went in for the first appointment with the urologist, and he said, yes, we should do some looking around, go get an MRI, and let's meet back here for an appointment. And the MRI showed nothing. I actually tried to cancel the cystoscopy because I was like, well, so since there's nothing on the MRI, I guess we can go ahead and say that it's all fine, right? And they're like, well, sometimes it doesn't show everything. And so then we ended up with the cystoscopy, and that was after Christmas. That was actually the day before my birthday on the 27th.
Can you describe, by the way, cystoscopy, just the human experience of it for people who aren't familiar?
What I will tell you is that men complain about this a lot more than women do. It's a little more complicated. There's more acreage that has to be covered with a man, but they're basically slipping a tiny tube with a camera through your urethra to head on into the bladder and have a look-see around. And then that's being shown on a screen. It might have a fancier term than that, but that's what's happening.
You could see the results of the cystoscopy as it was happening. And was it the urologist who was doing it and then kind of describing as it was happening, or did he or she wait till after to tell you what was going on?
He said, oh yeah, that's a lesion. That was his less scary word for a tumor. And I learned that that's what he meant when I had coffee with a good friend of mine who shares the same birthday as me the next day. And I go, oh, I'm not really worried about it because he said it was just a lesion. She goes, yeah, that's a nice word for a tumor. She's a doctor. So I thought, oh. And then I said, yeah, but at that point, I'm still feeling pretty positive because it could be a tumor. It could still be benign. Those happen as well. So we knew that had to be the next step was to schedule the TURBT, so the transurethral resection of the bladder tumor. So they again go in through the urethra and use whatever tools that they use to remove tumors. I imagine there's cutting things involved, and then they send that off for biopsy to find out what's going on with it.
By this time, we're in January of 2020, and they say, this is what's going to help us understand if it's benign or if it's not, and what we're dealing with here. Do you remember? Oh, actually, it says, so you got results 6 days later. This is almost a week later. We talk about scanxiety, and that really, I think, applies to any sorts of waiting before and after anything with results. Can you describe how you were able to manage that waiting time?
I focused on that I still had my kids at home and family to enjoy and everything else I could think of. I also had work. So I just focused on everything else that I could think of. And again, I'm flexing that muscle more and more and strengthening it to be able to put it off and say, I'll wait till I have more information before I freak out or get concerned. And I also discontinued Googling all this stuff at that point, which
which
is
can
what
be,
I advise.
yeah, right. That can be hard, right? Because it's
Yeah,
at our fingertips.
I know. Yeah.
And so 6 days later, Margo, is it a phone call? How do you find out the results?
No, 6 days later, I still had a catheter, which is just no fun. You're carrying a bag around and oh, so 6 days later was in the office. They remove the catheter and they go, okay, so you have stage 1, highly aggressive bladder cancer. And okay, so that's staggering. And then he drew a crude picture, not crude, like just like a basic picture of here's a bladder, here's the ureters, and he said, here's what's going on. Stage 1 means it's only in the bladder. It hasn't crept through to some of the other layers, 2, 3, 4, and so on. The good news about that is that we can treat this with BCG. I don't remember what that stands for, but it's related to what they use to treat tuberculosis. So immunotherapy in this case would be inconvenient, not very pleasant, because again, it's going through the urethra to deliver immunotherapy to the bladder. But so at this point, I'm just thinking, okay, so now I got to do this every 6 weeks, and then I got to have another cystoscopy. So I got to do this for the next 2 years so I'm making peace with that. That's what's happening in that doctor visit.
But going back to the important part, Margo, of how did you, I mean, do you remember that moment? Because, these are the first words you're hearing, first time you're hearing cancer and that it's confirmed. What's going on through your head and how are you feeling?
I think this is probably the case for a lot of us. You're thinking this cannot be. This doesn't make any sense to me. Nothing about this makes sense to me. This couldn't be more out of the blue. 0 kind of cancer runs in my family. Lots of other stuff, but just not that. I couldn't make any. They say smokers. I mean, smokers are associated with many kinds of cancer, and actually bladder cancer is one of the things that smoke. So I'm like, it's not that, because in the meantime, I had done research on causes, trying to understand, well, how did we get here? I gave up sodas. I eat clean. I drink a lot of water. I exercise. I do all those things. I thought I had a contract with cancer. I will do the lifestyle things over here and you leave me alone. I thought that I had made that arrangement, and cancer didn't sign that contract, so it was void. And you just never know. I'm told by doctors that sometimes you can figure it out and sometimes you can't, and sometimes it's just random, which is 100% unsatisfying. So just going through all of that's going on in your head at one time. How did this happen? How can this be true? So all of that was going on through my head at the time, and it's frightening.
Absolutely. And not only that, that was you processing on your own. Was anyone with you at the appointment? How did you break the news to the rest of the family?
So hubby was with me the whole time for all of that, which was really great. His name is Coleman, and he's unbelievable. I think that caregivers have a whole different set of needs than patients. They go through they go through all of it with us, just not the physical part of it. And they can't lean on us as patients to be there for them. So they definitely need to have resources and support. So it was wonderful that he was able to be that support for me. With me, I could squeeze his hand as tight as I needed to, and he could handle that. And then we just looked at each other like, okay, well, we're going to get through this somehow, some way. We don't need to know all of the ways and the details and what comes next. We don't need to know all those things. We just know we're going to get through this. And then now that my kids are at this point, they're 19 and 21, they're adult. One's in town, one is not in town. And this is not news you like to break over the phone to people. Now, I want to pause right here and just say, part of what made this hard for me telling my kids is I'm their only living parent. So when they were in middle school, their father died. I was not married to him at the time, but he died, and there wasn't a reason that he should have died, but he did. He basically died from alcoholism. He drank himself to death. So that was a terrible experience for me to have to come home and tell them that their father had died. So not only was I thinking, I don't want to worry them because I am their only parent. I don't want them to be worried that, because even though they're 19 and 21, they still need parents and family. And so that was the biggest concern I had, was how do I make sure that I explain this to them in a way that doesn't feel as scary and life-threatening and doesn't freak them out. But I don't want to mince words either. I don't want to mislead them. I don't want to sugarcoat it, right? So kind of choosing the right way to communicate with each of them. Now, at this point, that's all I know about my cancer. So I'm still thinking, okay, it's garden variety, essentially, and this is going to be really inconvenient. That's what I understood at that point.
Is there anything you learned in terms of guidance for other people on how to navigate that?
Yes, there is. I learned that the best way to do this, at least for me and definitely for them, is to go right to it and to say, Reed, we just got home from the doctor, and it does turn out that this is cancer. It is stage 1, and here's what we're going to do about it. Right to the point. And don't go heavy into details. Like in this case, I just said, and here's the therapy they're going to, they're grown, so they can understand it, but that's not the point of the conversation. And then followed up right away with, and we're going to get through this.
But I do like, again, how you were able to bookend this with straight to the point, but also, hey, we're going to get through this.
Right.
So now going back to, you've been diagnosed with aggressive stage 1 bladder cancer. Oh my gosh. Now this urologist, who, by the way, you found with great reviews online, says, here's the plan for 2 years. Still, despite all that, there was something in you that said, I need a second opinion, right? What led you to that?
Actually, it's my job. I sell health insurance policies for self-employed people like realtors. And I had learned a lot about what most policies do and don't include. And second opinion is really, really important. So I'd learned that the data shows that the number of misdiagnoses is really high. I didn't know how high for cancer. It's actually 70% is what my oncologist told me. I know. I said, how many of the cases you see are wrong, or it's or an incomplete diagnosis? And they all said in separate appointments, 70%. So I knew to take advantage of a second opinion service, which I did. And the second opinion service was an oncologist, urologist. Back up for a second. I went to see a urologist. At this point, what do I know? Do I know that there's a urologist oncologist in the world? I know nothing of this world. I don't know that I should be seeing an oncologist urologist. Who tells you that? Not your urologist. So there's a lot of this seeking information, gathering it real time while you're experiencing it, trying to process it, trying to hold it together, and figuring out what's the best path forward. It, as you know, is a mind-numbing experience. It's a soul-numbing experience.
100%. And it's a full-time job that a lot of people can't afford to give that much time to, balancing everything else in life going on. So I really appreciate you talking about that. And I'm so glad you knew from your own experience. If you hadn't had that experience selling the health insurance policies, right, you may not have known this to ask for a second opinion.
I may not have. And I'd kind of like to think I would, but I can't say for a fact that I would. You don't know what you don't know. So if you are aware and then you choose to not get that information, okay, that's on you. But if you don't even know, it's tough to say, oh, I should have gone and done that. So I'm really glad I did go get that second opinion from a specialist who was a urologist oncologist.
You saw the urologist oncologist who then did recommend something different.
He did. He said about 20 or 30% of the time, this was his number, stage 1 bladder cancer is actually stage 2 bladder cancer, completely different treatment regimen. I want you to go get a blue light cystoscopy. And I thought, ooh, that sounds almost fun. So blue light cystoscopy, because the blue light picks up on cancer cells that aren't visible to the naked eye. Okay, that sounds like a good thing to do. So I hung up the phone. It was a virtual visit, and then I called my urologist office, and he said, "Oh, I don't have the equipment to do that. It's a good test. I believe in it, and one day we'll all use it. But right now, nobody in Austin does it." So I did my own research. I live in Austin, Texas. MD Anderson's right down the road in Houston, 3 hours away. I'm aware of them and their reputation. And I thought, well, I'm stage 1 garden variety bladder cancer. I don't need to go to MD Anderson. Why did I think that? I have no idea. That's kind of the bias that you have in it's not that serious, I think might be, I so wanted to cling to that. But at any rate, when this was recommended, the second MD recommended the blue light, and I couldn't find one here, I had to start doing research. And I found that there were 3 places nearby, and one was San Antonio and 2 were in Houston. And what I did, and I think this is really smart, is always ask the people who know more than you do, and ideally who know the most of any one thing. So what did I do? I sent those names to the urologist, oncologist, who was the specialist of my second opinion. I said, what do you think of these? And he goes, I can vouch for these 2. Okay, so I'm just saying, don't go to the one in San Antonio. He didn't vouch for that one. And then I basically figured out how you open up records and let hospitals see your records and start the process of, you don't know how any of that works. And so you're figuring that out as you go. How do you get an appointment? And I went through the process of getting the documents and my records and everything to them. And within days, appointments started showing up on my calendar. MD Anderson, you're going to have a blood test. You're going to have blah, blah, all these different things. And I thought, okay, I guess I'm going to MD Anderson. And then I thought, and they're one of the best. They're rated the top all the time. So I felt confident about that, and good that I'd found one that was highly recommended, so I was at this point still hopeful that this was just mainly super inconvenient and uncomfortable. So I did a bunch of breathing exercises while we sat in the room waiting for him to come in. I'd done blood work and x-rays and things. And but I'm still thinking that he's going to go, yep, we need to do immunotherapy. But I also know there's a chance that it could be something else. So and it takes forever. There's so much waiting, as you know. So I used all of my best coping skills to get through it felt like an hour. It probably was 30 minutes, breathing in and out and just trying to stay calm. And then when he came in and talked to us, he got right to the point. And he said, we're not going to do a blue light cystoscopy. We're not going to do a blue light cystoscopy tomorrow or at all. Because looking at your slides, at the images from your biopsy, you have not 1, but 2 forms of cancer in your bladder. And I'm thinking, yet another thing I had no idea was possible. What's the limit? How many is the most you can have in one place? 2. And so he said, the first kind that you already know about will respond to BCG. The second kind is lethal. It is very rare, it's fatal, and it always comes back. We have to do everything. And if we do everything, we throw the kitchen sink at it, we can save your life. And that is the hardest thing I've ever had to hear. You don't even know how to react when that's what you hear. Save my life? I'm fine. Look at me. I'm healthy. I don't feel anything. And how can there be? He went on to explain that the second form is a plasmacytoid, and it does sinister things like cloak itself and make itself look like bladder cells to the other bladder cells. That's very sneaky. And so that is one of the reasons it's so hard to treat. And so throwing the kitchen sink at it in this case was 4 kinds of chemo every other week for 8 weeks, followed by a radical cystectomy. And that is the removal of the bladder and usually some other things along the way.
Wow. you've just described, I'm sure it was just so much, obviously, in the moment to try and even, you thought you had already gotten the worst of it. It's cancer. You've got already one diagnosis.
Right.
Um, how different was it for you to even take? I mean, you already had that big hit that first time, but then to hear something that you didn't even know was possible, to have a second one. Yeah. Just how did you, what were you feeling?
It was indescribable. It felt like my throat, my stomach all just dropped. And I thought I'm going to black out. I really thought I was going to just pass out. So I, my husband's with me, thank goodness. And so I held his hand. He listened for both of us, which is great because in some ways I did black out. I was conscious, but I don't recall the conversation after that. And my husband will say, remember when he said, blah, blah, blah. And you said yada, yada, yada. And I'm like, no, I don't remember that. I don't. I remember the part I just shared with you and really nothing after that.
And I think that's I mean, I can't even fathom a second diagnosis, but even just with the first, I know that happens a lot. As we wrap up this part of the conversation before heading into treatment and everything else to come, I think this comment and highlighting of seeing a specialist. Two things. One, this entire time you've been talking, there have been lots of instances of you advocating for yourself. What can you share about that? What you've learned about that?
I feel like the most important thing for any of us to do as individuals who need to have access to healthcare, the best thing we can do is advocate for ourselves all along the way. And that doesn't mean yelling and screaming and saying, get somebody in here. What that means is being, I think we almost have it's almost a passive acceptance and total trust of anybody in a white coat. And doctors are amazing. And I have huge respect for them and nurses and everybody who does all that work. But they don't know each of us individually, and no one knows us like we do. Pardon me. I think it's really important to listen to our instincts, to listen to our gut. And my instincts were saying, I joked it was my spidey sense was like, this doesn't feel right, and listening to that and then just keep getting information. Don't accept no answers when you can get answers, and then always go to the very best that you can get your hands on because they've seen the most cases. So what I think is important, let's take a look at what the Austin doctor and Austin pathologist had versus MD Anderson doctors and MD Anderson pathologists. They had the same images, same exact data. So it was really important to get the best eyes on it. They already knew before I got there what the diagnosis was and what they were going to need to tell me. And they knew that because they see so many more. I asked, for example, this is so rare, it's like 1%, 2% of bladder cancer patients, but they see 4 or 5 of them a month, which is like just so many, relatively speaking. And there are very few survivors of plasmacytoid. They don't often get to save their lives because it's also asymptomatic. So sneaky, asymptomatic, and 100% fatal and recurring. So if you don't know you have it, by the time you do, you typically don't have much time left. So I can thank the first kind for giving me the flowy tumor that there was to see to take me to the doctor, and then thank myself for continuing to advocate and go to the best doctors I could find. And don't rest if there's something I'm thinking needs to be addressed or seen. So I think that's just so important for all of us. And we can advocate for ourselves without offending doctors. So this is something I want to mention. I feel like it's really common that we don't want to hurt their feelings. And I know some people will say, well, shame on you for worrying about hurting their feelings. Okay, well, maybe you don't care about other people's feelings, but I do. And this is a real thing for a lot of people. And so I did take into account my doctor's feelings. I did feel like I was being disloyal to get a second opinion. And it didn't change my behavior. It didn't change that I did go get that second opinion and in fact save my life. But it is a real thing that people go through.
You can have that feeling of, I don't want to offend, or I don't want to bug or annoy or whatever. But at the end of the day, we are and have to be our own advocates, and we can do it in a way that's respectful, but that's number one priority for sure. And I've also heard that good doctors will also really support finding a second opinion, right? It's not an ego thing. It's very much, sure, it's your prerogative and you go do what's best for you.
Right. And that's actually what my doctor said. And it was a good thing. I mean, I would have done it anyway. That just would have been more uncomfortable. But yeah, probably most of them will say that. So I think it's important to not have an expectation that either we're not going to feel that. So if we're thinking, I've got a diagnosis, the next thing needs to be get a second, maybe a third opinion. And if you feel this reticence or concern about how you're going to leave the doctor feeling, that's okay. Do it anyway.